Hello, apes, and welcome to screencast number 4 of the Chapter 3 series, Evolution, Biodiversity, and Population Ecology. So now I know all of you have been sitting there. Mrs. Saunders, you're talking about this evolution, you're talking about this adaptation, divergence, and all of this. How do we know? How in the world do we know? And one of the ways that we know is through the fossil record. So we know that a fossil is actually an imprint of an organism within layers of stone. And that fossil record tells us what kind of organisms exist that we haven't even seen before. American Indians used to think when they found a fossil in a rock that was actually the spirit of something that once lived. And if they found a fossil on a particular area, then they thought that ground was holy ground because of that fossil. So fossil records have always had some kind of value to us. The records are the cumulative body of fossils worldwide, and it shows us a record of life that has existed for about 3.5 billion years before man ever stepped foot on the planet, before man ever came up. So that's how we know of different plant species and animal species that have existed before. We can look at those fossil records that we have, and we can look at remains of organisms that have been frozen in time in the Arctic regions, and we can see how these organisms evolved into later ones. So the thought of the woolly mammoth evolving into what we know as the current elephant today, we can look at those fossil records and find the fossils of the mammoth and relate it to these organisms. The number of species that we have noticed from what we've been able to find has really increased over time. So we've gotten more species as time has gone on. We know that we've lost a lot of species to extinction, like the dinosaurs. And somehow I'm not too disappointed that we lost the dinosaurs because I wouldn't want to have a T-Rex invading my home every day. But we have lost some valuable species to extinction, and we know that there have been several mass extinctions that have happened in the past. Some we've been able to explain, others we have not been able to explain. So when we say extinction, extinction is the disappearance of a species from Earth. They no longer exist. They're gone. And when we take a look at how long on average do species tend to last, species have a long lifespan on Earth, or a long existing lifespan on Earth, and that's anywhere from 1 to 10 million years. So we actually have species like the horseshoe crab and the roach that are ancient species that have been around for 1 million of years or more. Extinction has historically been a natural occurrence. There's been changes in climate. There was a mini ice age in the 18th century that caused a loss of a large number of different species. And what we know about these extinctions is that once you lose a species, it's irreversible. It's not Jurassic Park. We're not able to, at this point, create a species to come back. We're trying, but we just haven't gotten to that point. My apes class last year laughed at me because there is a bird, and we're going to be talking about that bird shortly, that is called the moa. And the moa is now an extinct species, and they laughed because I would say, there's no moa, so there's no more. So we'll be talking about them, and maybe you'll get the same laugh from that. Maybe you chuckled a little bit. The number of species in existence is equal to the speciation, its ability to adapt and survive, minus that of those that have gone extinct. So that's what we're looking at, and that's why we feel like we haven't identified all the species yet. So here is a wonderful fossil that you're seeing and that we use. This is a paleontologist in India, and he was excavating a 50,000-year-old fossilized elephant skull. So what you're seeing here is this is part of the tusk, and there is the crown of his head. Eyes probably came out here. Huge, and what a great discovery that he's going through, and it's 50,000 years old. So we're able to glean a piece of history from this. So most of it, as I said, is natural causes, but since humans came on the planet a little over I don't know how many thousands of years ago, but with humans coming on the planet, human activity has profoundly affected the rates of extinction. We have hunted animals to extinction. We almost lost all of our bison, all of our buffalo, because we were hunting them for their fur. There's pictures of them with mounds, just mounds of skulls and carcasses, and it was all for the sport. The people liked the fur, and we almost lost all of the herd, and it has taken a couple hundred years to rebuild those bisons. When we hunt to extinction and we force species out because we're developing on the land, then we're causing a loss in that biodiversity, and that loss in biodiversity affects us. That's Nico barking. The mailman just came and didn't leave him a treat, so he's upset. So as I was saying before the dog barked, the rate of extinction is really going to affect people directly because of that biodiversity loss, because we depend on those organisms, for food. That's our primary source. So think of all the plants. If you're a vegetarian or a vegan, think of all the different plants you eat, or the beans, or the soy products, the tofu. That's your food. For people that are regular meat eaters like myself, we rely on animals as well. Chickens, we're big chicken and fish eaters, and we don't have beef that often, or we don't have pork that often, but we rely on those organisms. Fiber, our clothing, our furniture, our carpeting, made up of fiber. Our medicines are plant-based. I was really amazed when I went to Costa Rica, and I wish I had paid more attention at the time. We actually went through a medicinal garden, and we were shown different plants and what the plants do and what they heal, and some of them were better than just the over-the-counter drugs, synthetic drugs that are made. Not to mention, too, the ecosystem services that they provide, and there's a whole list of ecosystem services that we're going to be seeing. Pest control, climate control, flooding. We learned that marshes prevented flooding after we filled them all in and we got flooded. Nurseries, water purification. There's a whole list, about 15 or more ecosystem services that are provided. And when we impact our biodiversity, we impact those services. Here is a picture that shows the Earth about 10,000 years ago, and this would be what North America would have looked like. And it teemed with these different kinds of plants that they called megafauna, plants that we're not familiar with today. There were mammoths that you can see in the background of the picture, and camels, and giant ground sloths that you're seeing to the left over here. There were lions and saber-toothed cats and all different kinds of horses. They kind of look like zebras, don't they? But they're not a zebra. And nearly all of these large mammals went extinct suddenly once people arrived on the continent. We don't see these animals anymore. Similar extinctions occurred in other areas simultaneously when humans arrived, and it suggested to many scientists that overhunting or other human impacts like bringing disease in were responsible for these extinctions. So this is just one cause. Extinction can occur when the environment changes rapidly and natural selection cannot keep up. So we mentioned this already before. When there are extreme changes like severe weather and climate change, changing sea levels, we've got to be really careful with the changing seas right now because the chemistries of the seas are changing. The polar ice caps, they're melting, and that's fresh water. And you're taking fresh water and you're mixing it with the salt water. So you're changing the concentration of the salt water. So organisms that are dependent on living in a certain concentration of salt water aren't able to adapt, and they're dying off because of that. Another thing that happens with that is salt water is much more dense, and it settles to the bottom in colder, darker regions where those fish species, those animal species, plant species aren't adapted to living. So again, they're going to die out. The surface water is becoming fresher, higher evaporation levels, again impacting the climate, and that fresher water warms and cools faster than salt water does. So that changes the temperature in which the organisms are adapted to live in. We also have the problem of arrival of new species. You've heard of invasive species. We talked about that in biology class, and we looked at the zebra mussels. There's a chapter that we're going to be talking about that's dedicated to the zebra mussels, so I'm not going to really elaborate on them too much, but they're new to the United States over the past couple of decades. They're not a part of our geological history. We don't have any natural predators, and they're really wreaking havoc within our freshwater lake ecosystems with the species that are in there, and that's going to force extinction. The same thing, with geese. Geese are not indigenous to this area. The Canadian geese, guess where they're from? Canada. They're from the northern parts of North America. They're used to migrating down and staying in our area only over the wintertime. But guess what? They like it here and they stayed. So they're pushing out other species and causing them to be extinct. So being small in population size or specialized species, that's another way that an organism can be totally wiped out if you don't have a lot of those species. We have things that are referred to as endemic species, and these are species that only exist in a certain specialized area. When we have endemic species that they can only be found, let's say in the really warm climates or the really cold climates, then they are very susceptible to extinction, especially if there's going to be any kind of climate change. Endemic species, we usually have small populations, and these are species that are usually found on islands, and they have this great risk of being lost. We're running out of time on the screencast, so we'll see you, and I'll see you in the next one.